Ransomware or malware in healthcare. Now, we know the impacts here are significant, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. We're also going to get into the anatomy of an attack. It may start with ransomware or phishing or any other attack vector. The reality is that defenders have a tremendous opportunity after initial compromise to reduce their overall exposure and stay resilient. Now, as I mentioned, prevention is key. You'll never hit 100% prevention 100% of the time. That's the reality. No matter how much tooling you might have, no matter how big and sophisticated your teams are, no matter how much automation's built in, and no matter how much you educate your user community, the reality is compromise is inevitable. And this is where platform-based approach to security can truly shine. And this will help accelerate our understanding of the threat, the assets that are involved, and our ability to very quickly contain and remediate that threat. Now, when we talk about healthcare, it could be as simple as a nursing workstation that gets impacted with ransomware. And the initial vector could be a variety of things. The reality is it's going to happen. And when it does, it may impact our ability to deliver timely patient care. God forbid, it causes death or a loss of personal health information. Now you might think, well, is this problem really that big? Well, just in 2024 and halfway through 2025, there was over 231 million medical records stolen that can be sold for as much as $1,000 per record on the black market. If we do the math, that's over $231 billion in potential revenue. So if anything, the adversary is going to continue to double and triple down on this. Now, when we look at ransomware, there's lots of different vectors. Ideally, we want to prevent as early on as possible. So at the DNS layer, that's a tremendous opportunity for us. And now if we miss there, then maybe it's during the web connection, going through a next-gen firewall, or in the email itself. But if it lands on the endpoint, we better hope that we have 100% effectiveness 100% of the time. And again, the reality suggests that that'll never happen. So whether it comes in through USB or one of those other connections we've already mentioned, it may land on the endpoint. Again, the opportunity to prevent here is significant. We've got multiple layers of prevention in play. We may not always be able to defeat ransomware or malware in those early stages. And sometimes the disposition is unknown, meaning it's not clean and we haven't been able to identify it as malware. And this is where sandboxing comes in. The goal here is to send these files to a sandbox, detonate it, watch its behavior, and drive an outcome, and ultimately determine the disposition. Is it malware or is it clean? Now, there's other things that we can do that might identify malware in the organizations. So, for example, for early warning, you might have network detection response, and the asset is behaving differently on the network that might highly suggest malware is in play or ransomware is in play. For example, if an asset's starting to do an SMB 445 probe across your network, and it didn't do that before, you probably want to know about it. But it's a great way of baselining the environment, get a true understanding of the way the environment operates normally, and then when there's deviations, you can very quickly pick them out. The other opportunity is both in the data center at the workload level, whether it's Windows or Linux, doesn't really matter, on-premise or in the cloud, but building workload-based policies that only allow the service itself to operate in the manner in which the service needs to serve and nothing more. And inherently, you get a zero trust outcome. This is also something we can do on the campus infrastructure, whether it's wired, wireless, or even VPN for that matter, is again, assessing the assets before they connect to the network and giving them restricted access to the things they need in order to perform an activity and nothing more. And again, any deviations or any signal that's shared that suggests otherwise, we're going to take advantage of that and maybe evict the individual from the previous trust level. And then you've got XDR and SIM that we're going to use to help accelerate our ability to be able to respond and stay resilient. And then you have threat intelligence that'll use data from multiple different platforms. And then if something changes, you want this to inherently be systematically sent out to every one of those products. Sandboxing is a great example of that, where you're going to detonate that in the middle of a web request. That means that that malware will still land, if the disposition is malware, will still land on the asset, and you'll detonate it in a sandbox. You'll determine its outcome, and then you'll update your technologies with the new disposition. Now, in this case, if it did end up on the endpoint, you will actually go in and quarantine that file immediately, and we call that a retrospective event. Now, when we look at the technologies, we'll talk about a couple of these for prevention. So you got Cisco Secure Access. This provides DNS and web layer protection. That allows us to look at DNS-based requests, and very quickly, if it's malware, and we've got intelligence to suggest that, we can block it. And this is nice because there's no HTTP connection that's even attempted at this point. The adversary doesn't even know that you've made a request to their site. Likewise, if we have to proxy the connection and tear into the payload and look at the file itself, we have the ability to do advanced inspection against the file and even sandboxing it in that centralized sandbox, as I mentioned earlier. And we've got all the analysis to help support it. So we can see here a web-based request was blocked using Cisco AMP disposition. It was malicious. It gives you the details. You can pivot into this. Now, this is all good stuff if it's blocked, right? Because now I'm blocking, I'm getting rid of the noise. It's very early on in the attack chain, and I'm seeing some success. I can do this even for private application access. So if I'm using ZTNA functionality or VPN, I have the ability to do inspection of files and do file type blocking as well. Again, the goal here is to minimize my risk as soon as possible. And very quickly, I could do some security activity searches. I can look for malware specifically, or command and control, phishing, etc., and to get a very quick view of what's been taking place in my organization in the last 24 hours. Now, the other opportunity for us here is leveraging Cisco Secure Firewall and the next generation firewall capabilities, more specifically the malware inspection portion that we're talked about, but also, as important, the intrusion prevention capabilities. Now, with Cisco, we do server to client, client to server, and you have to do both sides of the equation because you could identify potential malware with an IPS signature. That might be an indicator of something nefarious. Now, we can see the dashboard here. It calls out malware threats, indications of compromise by user. We also have indications of compromise by host. You've got security intelligence. And again, these dashboards can be created based on your specific role within the organization itself. When we look at malware, we get a good list of malware, the summary of it, the file names, the detections that were triggered, the file type, the count. But this is what's really cool. You have the ability to very quickly pivot in and see the relationship, or what we call network file trajectory, the ability to see the relationships between malware and the associated hosts with this campaign. Now we see the SHA, the file name. We can look at the current disposition. You can look at the threat score. You can even look at the report itself. You can see the relationships between each one of them. And I can even pivot into the user or the host to get a good sense of any other indicator of compromise that may have taken place. And you can see here, there's a lot that's taking place with this particular identity. And you can see there's some intrusion events, there's phishing and exploit kit, there's encrypted visibility, so suspicious activity taking place in an encrypted channel without decrypting the payload itself. And we can see it's probably malware communication that's taking place. And now we move to email. And this is an opportunity for us to advance our ability to defend at a place that still is the number one vector of compromise. Now, there's lots of things that can happen here, whether it be business email compromise, phishing, or malicious activity such as ransomware. Our ability here to mitigate risk is significant. This includes external email coming internally, but also internal email going external, may be obvious, but the other one is internal email to internal email. So this is within the organization itself, and the ability to look for things like ransomware or advanced phishing techniques of a compromised account is going to be significant in our ability to defend. This includes using large language models to understand what might be happening with no clear identifier of risk. Now you can see in this example here, we've got a low file reputation. So we've got a SHA-256, low reputation, malicious. Okay, that's pretty obvious. But we also see it's from a frequent sender. So I've received email from this individual more than once. The other thing is we frequently receive email from that specific domain itself. Now we get a good view of the impact over time, what threat messages, where we're mitigating and identifying threats. And this is going to allow us to enhance our security posture in other areas when we're seeing an influx of threats coming in through a specific vector. We can see message by direction. So whether it's outgoing, internal, or incoming, we get a perspective of that. We see the number of threats that are being convicted. We also see the remediation. So some of the things that we can do here is that if a threat is identified, we can very quickly go into the mailbox itself and tear out that attachment that might have been associated to ransomware. This ensures that the user is not able to double-click that attachment and compromise the system. Now, if they did double-click the attachment, because our preventative capability failed, this is where we get into secure endpoint. This is where you come into multiple engines running at the same time to provide the highest level of efficacy to prevent ransomware, but also doing things like looking at the system process and protecting them, looking at behaviors. And if you're a clean file that happens to be associated to a bad IP, well, it's just like when your mother told you growing up, you are who you hang with. This is the same thing. If a clean file is hanging out with a bad IP, well, they're going to get marked as malicious, even if they're not. And the goal here is to prevent 100% of every threat. The reality is you can't. And when you can't, you can have automation to forensically take a snapshot of the asset before quarantining it, no matter if it's on-premise or at the local coffee shop or anywhere in the world. If the threat has been identified, we can very quickly quarantine that. And we associate this with MITRE ATT&CK, so we really have a true appreciation of the tactics and techniques the adversary is using for success. And you could also, again, like the other technologies we've talked about this far, is that you have the ability to run this in a sandboxed environment and look at the behaviors, the outcomes, and even interact with that. We see the vulnerabilities, so this helps us identify potential avenues of success for the adversary, and it gives you a true risk score based on the real risk of the vulnerability being exposed. Now, as we move to secure malware analytics, this is the sandbox. This is the thing that consumes unknown files, detonates it in an outside-looking-in sandboxed environment where there's nothing in the virtual execution space to allow malware writers to know that they're being monitored. In fact, we abstract the drivers, we create dynamic data in the environment itself. We've got automation around activity of the asset while it's being detonated, like mouse movement. And the goal here is to improve our ability and effectiveness in discovering behaviors that suggest bad. Now, all of our technologies that have a malware component to it will send to the centralized sandbox. Now, the nice thing is, as a defender, you have one place to go to see all of the samples that have been detonated. And you can interact with this manually as well. So you can do your own submissions, you can rerun them. In fact, you can run these in a glove-boxed environment where you can interact with malware in case you need a human to invoke a behavior that an automation playbook cannot. Now you can see here, this is threat score of 100. This is the worst possible threat score. And it shows you the judgments, the verdicts, the indicators, and the sources. But the one thing I'll call out here is the assets. Now, if you have secure endpoint, it would actually show you the endpoints this particular sample is on within your environment. We can look at the MITRE attack framework and see what associated tactics and techniques that were discovered during the analysis. We can look at the process timeline, the process tree, and as I mentioned, we can interact if an analyst needs to invoke certain activities that is not created through a playbook. You're empowered to do so. All of that's recorded and reported on. Now, with network detection and response, now this isn't a preventative capability, but it's an early warning detection mechanism that's tremendously valuable. And you may see behaviors in the environment that suggest ransomware or malware is in fact in play. Now we can look and drill into each one of these alarms, whether it's command and control, recon, exploitation, data hoarding, and so on. And we can see the relationships between the network connections on the inside as well as external network-based connections and any alarms associated with that individual asset that we're investigating. We can see the top security events, and we can drill into each one of the flow records that have been collected. Consider this like a cell phone. You've got every single call that you've made with your cell phone. You've got the duration, the time, the destination, right? The caller ID, all of that is documented. And you can use that information to determine some level of pattern. And you can do this on the network side as well. And so you're not looking into the payload itself. You're looking at the flow data and you're wrapping that around machine learning models to determine if that particular connection is behaving nefariously. And we can see here we've got a connection using 443, so we know it's encrypted. And this might be an indication of a command and control channel that's taking place. We can see internal network scanners, remote access breaches, possible malware in the environment, vulnerable servers that might exist, as well as DNS requests that put us at risk. We also see top high-risk countries that we've determined as high risk, and any communication to those countries we want to be alerted on. So again, the goal here is an early warning detection system, secure workload, or application segmentation. Now, the challenge defenders have had in the past is our ability to build prescriptive-based controls on the workloads themselves without causing disruption in the environment. And so in today's world, we have the ability to use what we call as application dependency mapping to build the policies that are required to deliver on the workloads themselves. This workload could be Windows, it could be Linux, it could be a container, it could be in the cloud, on-premise, physical, doesn't really matter. The controls are built consistently based on the way the application is communicating, provides the rule base back to you. A human then will evaluate the rule base, make the adjustments required as you do this policy analysis to ensure that the control that you're natively going to put on Windows Firewall or within IP tables or within eBPF or within a security group in your respective cloud service provider, you're going to be able to do that seamlessly without disrupting the environment. As you move into this risk-based focused outcome for your workload and application environment, you make it very difficult for the adversary to move laterally within the organization, which is critical to the success of ransomware and malware. And you can make sure that you are meeting these objectives over time, leveraging compliance reporting and identifying where your risks are, where the CVEs may still exist that put you at risk, and build very prescriptive-based controls to ensure that the vulnerability can't get exploited or minimizes your risk if exploited, and you're driving towards a zero trust outcome. Now, on the campus infrastructure, we can identify every asset that's connecting to the environment, and we can build prescriptive-based policy to allow it to only access what it requires and nothing more. And this includes the workload environment and sharing that identity into that environment. But what we might be able to do is take the signals that we're receiving from other technologies, whether it's vulnerability information, whether it's a bad file or malware or ransomware that we've identified in the environment, can be shared back into the platform and we can take action against it. So at 2 a.m., when a printer has identified ransomware, that information is shared with Identity Services Engine that automatically quarantines, moves it into a restricted VLAN environment to ensure that there is no propagation of malware. And it allows your team to quickly triage the threat and know that you don't have to action it at 2 a.m. in the morning. You can follow up during your regular working hours. Now, what if malware is realized in an environment and you do have a restrictive based zero trust outcome within the campus infrastructure, but there's still communication that is allowed because the business requires it, right? You can't isolate 100% of everything. And so communications between assets within the same layer 2 domain may still take place. Well, how do you mitigate that if ransomware does take advantage of that access? Well, if it does take advantage of it, what you can do is create a matrix here that is called a DEFCON policy that allows you to be able to very quickly remove that access from an environment when bad happens. So you might normally have a production matrix that does certain things that restricts access in the environment, but also allows access. In a incident, you may actually reduce the amount of access an environment has. And you can deliver this directly to an individual floor, as an example, or to an entire building with a push of a button. Now, the reality is, no matter what you do, ransomware still may make its way into the environment. And so when we look at the anatomy of an attack, we can start seeing a lot of things have to take place for the adversary to be successful. This includes execution, persistence, privilege escalation, defense evasion, credential access, discovery, lateral movement. Now, I'll tell you, 60 to 70% of all breaches involve lateral movement. To me, this is the greatest opportunity for defenders. Collections, command and control, exfiltration, and impact. Now, I've given some examples of some of the techniques that are associated with each tactic. Now, defenders have the opportunity to mitigate in multiple different areas. And so I've included a pink color for detection and user awareness, and then prevention. And I'm calling out kind of the capability that drives a mitigating control. Now, we've talked about ransomware, email security, endpoint protection, detection and response, DNS and web content prevention, next generation firewall. They're all preventative capabilities. And then network detection and response is really more of a detection capability. But if you associate it to the response element, it might not prevent it, but it might help you isolate the threat very, very quickly. And I kind of went through and I did that for every area, right? For execution, they're using PowerShell. So you can use endpoint protection, you can use EDR, you can do code signing, you can make sure PowerShell needs to be authenticated. Persistence, you got endpoint protection, EDR, command line capture in the event that execution took place. You've got auditing for privilege escalation. You got privilege account management. You can update software, user account control, defense evasion. And again, you can see a theme. There's a lot of endpoint protection or endpoint detection response. So every capability doesn't require you a different product. The goal here is to leverage whatever is in your toolbox and to make it as difficult as possible for the adversary to be successful in every one of these steps. Lateral movement, network segmentation, or workload or application segmentation. Those are going to help prevent the adversary's ability to move laterally, to allow ransomware to spread. Network detection response, that's going to be that early warning detection system that's going to let you know. And it goes on, right? There's tremendous opportunities for a defender. But if you only look at ransomware and don't assume breach, you may assume that those preventative capabilities around malware are enough, which I know you don't. But the reality is that if we think of success from an adversarial perspective, then we can start looking at where their next step is and get in front of as many of those as possible. You don't need 100% protection 100% of the time. Now, what happens when they fail? There's lots of different vectors that come in: advanced phishing, ransomware, malware, social engineering, denial of service, credential theft, and it goes on, right? Even AI threats now are becoming prevalent. And so this is where XDR and SIM coming together provides the next generation of what the Security Operations Center should look like. And so when we look at XDR, this is going to be your primary tool when an incident occurs. This is going to take and ingest all the signals and observations from all the tooling, whether that be Cisco or third party. In fact, the third party integrations have been curated and validated and supported by Cisco. So if you have CrowdStrike, Microsoft Defender, SentinelOne, Proofpoint, if you've got all of these different technologies in play, you can integrate them into Cisco XDR, get the enriched data into the platform, and be able to analyze it across all the different signals that you might be getting in an organization. And this allows us to map this to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, provide what we call as a financial risk score to each one of these tactics and techniques to give you a better idea of the risk factor associated here. When you drive into an incident, we leverage what we call as progressive disclosure that allows you to see the right information at the right time without overwhelming the analyst. The goal here is to move tier 2 down to a tier 1 analyst, where we're using AI to help support the human and making sure that they understand where they are in the particular incident and what they might need to do next in order to mitigate the risk. Now, we can very quickly see the MITRE ATT&CK tactics and techniques that are associated with this particular incident. And what we have the ability to do is very quickly see all these interesting observations and the relationships between each one to build out an attack chain. Now, this might include somebody's identity, the risk profile associated to that identity, the device, the risk profile associated with that device, an email, a subject, a sender, a recipient, a PowerShell script on an endpoint from a macro and a Word document. It provides you a very quick view of the relationships of each one of those observations. And at any point in time, you can take action just using the drop arrow key to very quickly say, I want to mitigate this observation that happens to be a SHA in my next gen firewall, in my endpoint, in my email security, in my web proxy, etc. Drive that outcome systematically with a push of a button. Also, we walk through the incident response process with you. So we identify, contain, eradicate, and recovery. And we can walk through this, and based on your integrations, you can drive outcomes going through the incident response process. And we audit and log every bit of this. Now, we also have pre-canned playbooks, or you can create your own playbooks within the Cisco XDR platform. Now, this is no to low code effort here. For the most part, you can drag and drop these elements in, add the workflow property details that are required to make that function work, but you don't need to be a developer to be able to build these playbooks. Again, there's a community with a ton of these playbooks already pre-canned from Cisco and the community at large. Now, what happens when you need to pivot from XDR into more data or longer term data? This is where Cisco Splunk comes in. This is an example from Black Hat this year. You can see that we've got multiple incidents that are taking place over a period of time. You can see the tactics, initial access, execution, privilege escalation taking place. All of this is summarized for me. And if I need to pivot and drill down into this, that's the power of Splunk. It's a data analytics platform first, and allows me very quickly to see data that I may not see in real time within my XDR platform. Likewise, I may have started here, and I need to pivot from here into XDR to see real-time events that might be taking place and the relationships of those observations in one place. So seamlessly being able to pivot into each one of the platforms is critically important for us to reduce the time to resolution. Now, here's another dashboard that shows multiple different vendors all coming together for the common good, all the data is being centralized. And again, you can pivot that into Cisco XDR and vice versa. Here's an example of Splunk SOAR, where we've got the workflow itself that allows us to look at multiple different technologies very quickly to identify certain observations or artifacts of interest. And based on the outputs of each one of these, I'm going to drive a specific action. Now here we're looking at umbrella. We're investigating an IP, we're a domain, we're looking at an endpoint, looking at device info, and maybe based on some of the dispositions and results that we get back, we might take action. That action might be block the domain in Umbrella, block an IP and a domain in Firepower or Cisco Secure Firewall, or quarantine an endpoint. Again, these workflows can drive the outcome that you desire. Now, here's something that really starts to elevate. Because Splunk is a data analytics platform, imagine having the ability to be able to centralize who is accessing what medical record, when, and from which application. So you can see here, this is an example providing you medical record activities, user activity. The most active user is Paul, currently accessing medical records. And it tells you the application name. It could be Meditech, Omnicell, it could be Epic. All of this can be centralized in one place. Now, correlate this with a security event such as malware. You have a nursing workstation that has malware on the asset, and all of a sudden we see that specific nurse accessing medical records at a rate and speed that they've never done before. That's scary. We not only have ransomware, but now we may have an exfiltration attempt because a user's asset was compromised and now accessing medical records at a rate that's alarming. So having the correlation between these business applications and security events may transition the way we look at a security event, even if it was blocked in our traditional tooling. But because a business application has determined an increase of risk associated with the application, we tie those two things together and we've got an interesting event taking place that may otherwise go unnoticed. Cisco Security, ransomware, and malware in healthcare.